thanks so much for being here. My name is Kat and I make houseplant videos here on Good and Planty. If you just so happen to absolutely love this video, please consider liking it, commenting, subscribing, or following me on Instagram. All of these things help me grow my channel like a plant. So today's video is part of the genus series here on my channel where I kind of do a generalized overview of one common houseplant genus at a time. I used to say deep dive, but that's really not what I'm doing here. So today we're talking all about the philodendron and I will go over basic care tips, propagation, and share my philodendron collection with you all so that you can see some of the fun varieties. I do have both common and uncommon plants, so you should get a good variety at the end of the video. I will pop up the time codes on the screen if you want to jump to the section that you are most interested in, and let's just get started. Philodendron are tropical plants, so you will absolutely see that pop up in the care tips that I'm going to share later on in the video. Philodendron are a huge genus of plants. There are about 450 species of philodendron, and they are the second largest genus in the Araceae family of plants, I think second to Anthurium. I love philodendron so much because they can kind of fit whoever you are and whatever your environment is. There are tons of very easy varieties and species for beginner houseplant owners, and if you are an advanced houseplant owner, there are tons of challenging species to keep things a little bit more spicy. You can truly find the philodendron that works for you, is what I'm trying to say. Okay, moving right along to the generalized care tips for philodendron, I'm going to once again emphasize that since there are so many philodendron, not all of them are going to fit under the same care guidelines. This is a very generalized idea of what philodendron like. Okay, let's kick things off with water. In general, philodendron do enjoy drying out a little bit between waterings. You can use tap water with this plant for the most part, which is a huge bonus because keeping up with distilled and filtered water is of course a little bit annoying. So any plant that is fine with tap is great in my opinion. Some visual signs that you will see if your philodendron is thirsty are droopy leaves, so maybe like the vines are hanging down a little bit more than usual, and some floppy leaves. So this plant could actually use a water because you can see I can very easily wrinkle and bend this leaf. And also I would check more of the older, larger growth as opposed to the smaller, newer growth, because odds are this leaf will be soft majority of the time, whereas this leaf can tell me a little bit more accurately if this plant is thirsty. These plants will definitely be more forgiving to underwatering than overwatering. If you're kind of on the fence of whether or not to water your philodendron, I would definitely hold off a little bit because they'll probably bounce back a lot faster from underwatering. If you are giving this plant too much water, some signs that you will see are yellowing of the leaves, some leaf loss, as well as mushy stems down at the base of the plant. And then if you pull the plant out of the pot, you will probably see black and mushy roots, and these are all signs of root rot, which happens when your plant sits in overwatered soil. On the flip side, if you are underwatering your plant, it will probably also be very droopy, maybe a little bit of yellowing. However, if you pull the plant out of the pot or stick your finger in it, the soil will be very, very dry. Okay, moving on to light. In general, these plants definitely appreciate bright indirect light. Some of the more green varieties that don't really have any variegation, stuff like that, can tolerate lower light for sure. Another great thing about these plants is that they do well under grow lights. So I have some of my plants under grow lights, and I also have some of my plants in bright indirect light within windows. I kind of have put philodendron in any facing window and they've done all right. So again, they're pretty flexible plants, which is a reason why I love them so much. If your plant is getting too much light, you will probably see a little bit of a bleached look, so the color will be fading. You might see some crispiness forming on the leaves and maybe some leaf loss wherever the source of light is coming from. So if you're seeing a lot of leaf loss and yellowing on this front side of the plant, but the back side is looking healthy, then you can kind of, you know, figure that wherever the plant is facing the light is too much light. If your plant is not getting enough light, you will see that the leaves are going to start spacing out way too much on the vine, and it's going to get a little bit of a leggy look. And on top of that, the leaves will probably get smaller in size. That is kind of common with trailing plants. plants, but you can see that this plant is getting a decent amount of light, and even though the leaves are getting a little bit smaller, they're not super spaced out on the vine. I don't know if you could see that. Soil and repotting, so that is very important for these plants. Make sure you are keeping your philodendron in very airy, chunky soil. What do I mean by that? Basically, I'm talking about soil amendments, so make sure you're adding things like pumice or perlite and orchid bark to the soil, because you want to make sure that it drains quickly while still retaining a little bit of moisture so that there is something for the plant to drink up. However, if it doesn't drain well enough, then too much water will sit in the pot, and then you will see things like root rot start to develop. Whatever soil you want to use, whether you are making your own or you're using store-bought, just make sure that they are getting enough nutrients, because they do really love to grow and absolutely need nutrients, which I will kind of cover more in fertilizing. These plants absolutely don't mind being root bound, so if you're seeing roots start to poke out of the bottom of the drainage hole, I don't know, maybe you can see this. See, you can see the roots starting to crowd around the bottom hole there, and probably eventually they will make their way out. That doesn't really concern me with these plants. They can sit like that for a little while. Of course, there are extreme circumstances where you will definitely know when it's time to repot your plant. In general, you know, if your plant starts to decline or there's way too much roots coming out of the bottom, then I will go ahead and repot this plant. When they are ready to be potted up, go about 1 or maybe 2 inches up in pot size, and I would go with either terracotta or a nursery pot. All right, humidity and temperature. Temperature for these plants is fairly easy, as with a lot of other houseplants. That's why they are houseplants. Under 55 degrees Fahrenheit is probably the main limit that I would give for these plants, because they are tropical, so at the end of the day, they do appreciate a bit of a warmer environment above 55 degrees, and try to avoid drafts and spaces like next to radiators, windows, doors, that kind of thing. Humidity does vary quite a bit with philodendron. The more rare varieties, I'm thinking of plants like Philodendron varicosum, definitely need high humidity to really thrive and do well in a home environment. However, some more common varieties like this philodendron that I have here will do just fine in average home humidity levels. Of course, they will grow probably faster and a little bit bigger next to a high humidity area, but you won't see anything like crispy tips start to develop if this plant is in low humidity, because guess what? It is in low humidity and it's doing just fine. Fertilizer. So as you may have gathered, these plants love to grow, so they will definitely benefit from some fertilizing once in a while. I use an all-purpose balanced fertilizer from Espoma. I heavily dilute that liquid fertilizer in my watering can during the spring and summer months and just go ahead and water the plant as normal. And I probably do that every 2 to 3 weeks during the growing season. And you know, you might be able to fertilize these plants within the fall seasons, because you know, this plant is still growing, so it could benefit from some food. I just don't like to risk it, and I tend to not fertilize at all within the winter months. If you do over fertilize, you will see some leaf damage because the roots have burned, so that will probably look like yellowing leaves and some crispiness. Okay, and lastly, before we get to my philodendron collection, let's talk about propagation. Philodendrons are so easy to propagate, like they are a dream. Propagate your philodendron. It is so satisfying and easy and fun. Basically, for propagating, you need nodes. Nodes are everything when it comes to philodendron. Without a node, you can't really successfully propagate, because that is truly the growth point of the plant. Basically, an ideal propagation method is to go ahead and take a vine of your plant and snip below the node. I would probably leave about 1 inch or 2 below the node, ideally, and let your cuttings callus over for maybe an hour before you're placing them in either water or spag. If you see some sap coming out of the cut, like the little wound on the plant, that's totally fine and normal. Just be careful that you don't ingest that sap, obviously. So once you have that callus cutting, like I said, you can go ahead and either put them in a little container of water and change out that water at least once a week, or you can place it in some dampened spag and just make sure that spag is staying moist, and you can kind of make a little bit of a humidity bubble. That could be a whole separate video, but you know, that's kind of the gist of it. A little bit of a more advanced propagation method is to propagate these plants from wet sticks, and basically what a wet stick is just a piece of the stem with the node on it. You can go ahead and let those callus over for also like maybe an hour or so, and those I definitely recommend putting in spag, and you should see some roots pop out of one side and then a little bit of growth pop out on the other. I would say wet sticks are definitely a little bit less of a reliable propagation method, but it's really useful for rehabbing a certain plant if the node is fine. Once your wet stick or cutting or whatever is super happy and has roots of about 2 to 3 inches, you can go ahead and pot them up in a pot with some airy soil and keep that moist for about a week. Lightly moist, do not go overboard. Okay, so with all that being said, let's move on to my philodendron collection. Woo! So I'm gonna go ahead and start with a couple of my philodendron hederaceum, I think is how you say that. They're pretty common for the most part. Of course, there are a little bit more harder varieties to come by, but for the most part, these are the more accessible philodendron. Here we have one philodendron hederaceum. Let me go ahead and show you now that I have a nice camera. So this plant has really soft, beautiful leaves that are like a nice lime green, and then once they get a little bit older, they fade to a slightly darker color. I really like it, and when the new growth comes in, you also get a little bit of a nice orange color on the stem and a little bit on the leaves. Also, philodendron hederaceum are an example of philodendron that do like to climb up. They can trail down, but you will see one of my plants that are growing up on a moss pole. Okay, moving on with the heart-shaped leaves. We have the Philodendron Brazil. Now, this plant is on a moss pole, but this is not the moss pole that I recommend. You will see the moss pole that I am switching to in a later video. So this plant, you can see, has a very similar leaf shape to the plant that I just discussed, but the real draw here are these little areas of variegation down the middle. That has the more neon color, while you still get a little bit of the dark green color on the outside. Very pretty. Okay, and the last heart-shaped leaf philodendron that I have is my Philodendron micans. I will put in footage of my huge one that is growing up on the moss pole that I will recommend in a later video. I made that moss pole myself, and it'll be a little tutorial / info video. This is the Philodendron micans, and when I repotted that plant to go on the moss pole, I had a lot of foliage I cut off, so I'm just propagating them in some water. This is the water method, and it's really nice. It's a very velvety leaf. That's kind of like the draw. Here's like a little bit of a more perfect one if you want that content. Beautiful, beautiful plant. Nothing bad to say. And pretty easy care. Okay, let's spice things up with a little bit of a more uncommon philodendron. We have the Philodendron Florida Ghost. I love this plant so much. The variegation is stunning. The thing that you have to keep in mind is that the leaves will kind of fade over time. So this leaf is already fading a little bit. When it comes in, they're a lot more white. And then over time, there is a little bit of light damage on this leaf right here, kind of like what I talked about earlier, but it will fade to a more solid green color. So the newer growth will have beautiful variegation, whereas the older growth will be a little bit of a more simple green. So excited for this leaf. I think it's gonna be really nice, and it looks like it's gonna be big. And a bonus with this plant is the petioles. Look at this color! And there's like a nice texture on it too. Anyway, Philodendron Florida Ghost. Next we have a plant that I was rehabbing for quite some time, and it is finally in a pot and happy, and that is my Philodendron Imperial Red. You can see this is the biggest leaf that's left, and it is slowly on its way out, and then we have some new growth coming in there. A lot of it is deformed, and that's just from the stress that it was under for a very, very long time. It is a miracle that I still have this plant. It was a super, super bad case of root rot where I lost majority of the plant and tried really hard to rehab whatever I had left, and it's working. So I love this plant. I'm so excited. Okay, next we have a super baby plant that is propagating in moss, and that is my super baby Philodendron melanochrysum. I've never showed this plant to you all anywhere, not on YouTube, not on Instagram, and that's mostly because I'm really afraid of killing it, so I didn't want to get too excited just to have it die on me, but it's hanging in there. No super fast growth, and you can see that like This baby leaf is on its way out, but this leaf looks good. It was in leca when I first got it, but I don't know anything about leca, so I transferred it to some moss and I'm kind of just hoping for the best. I'm keeping it in the greenhouse and keeping my fingers crossed. I hope it's gonna be a good plant. Okay, next we have a pretty popular plant, I would say, and that is the Philodendron Prince of Orange. The main draw for this plant is that the new leaves, like this one for example, come in a little bit orange, and then over time they fade to a nice little green. And I do have a new leaf coming in. I don't think it's getting enough light, so I think that they're coming in a little bit deformed. So, you know, while I am showing my collection for fun, this is also a great learning tool because you can see how some philodendron decline in different ways. I think it's just too much to the side of a window maybe, and not enough humidity is my guess. Next up is one of my favorite philodendron. I kind of saved the best for last in my opinion. The next to last one is my Philodendron Silver Sword. I'm in love with this plant. For a little while, I kind of looked over this plant because I think that on a lot of pictures and videos, you can't really capture like the depth of beauty of this plant, but I'll try to show you. You can see that beautiful shine. It has like a bluish silver color. I'm also really proud of this plant because I got her as a 2-leaf cutting with 2 nodes and no roots. So she's doing pretty well, I would say, at least. The last plant that I'm going to talk about is my Philodendron Painted Lady. I've been waiting to have a camera so that I could properly show off this foliage because unfortunately I think that the iPhone does not capture this beauty, but look at this pattern. This variegation is gorgeous. And then also the stems have like this light pink color to it, similar to the Florida Ghost. Look at this new growth coming in. I think that's going to be a really satisfying, juicy leaf. I love this plant so much. I think some of my favorite plants are philodendron for sure. Anyway, so that, believe it or not, is it. Please comment down below any additional care tips that you have for philodendron. I'm sure I didn't cover it all. They are a huge genus with a lot of information, and I just tried to compact that a little bit into a shorter video, but I'd love to hear what you guys have to say. Thank you all so much for watching. I really appreciate it. Please subscribe if you don't already. Comment down below, follow me on Instagram, all of that good stuff, and I will see you in my next video. Bye!